There are two different ways you can walk. The first way, which I'm showing you here, is called an active way. And the second way, which I'll show you here, is a passive way. Now, these two ways, the passive way and the active way, probably look fairly similar. They are fundamentally different motions. And to explain how they're different, I'm going to start by just tracing an outline of the legs and then a dotted line of the torso in both the active walk and the passive walk. So same outline, and then the dotted line following the path of the torso. Now, with our active walk, this is a vertical line that's situated between these legs, upright, and so that there is no inertial tendency for this to go forward or backwards, because it is situated in such a way that my forward foot is about the same distance away from this dotted line as my rear-facing leg. So that if I were to continue that dotted line all the way down, if I were to show you the distances of the forward and the rear leg, you'll see that they are roughly the same. And if I were to then drag them out, like thus, those are essentially the same distances. So that meaning that my forward foot is the same distance from this dotted line as my rear foot is. Now, if I were to do the exact same thing with my passive walk, well, my torso follows this distance. It is just a continuation of my rear-facing leg. This d equals 0. So that my forward-facing foot has the maximum distance. This foot has d equals, let's call it a max. The actual values don't really matter, but the point is the distances are different values. Whereas on the active walk, these two distances are equal to each other, as we've established. Now, this is really important because this distance value, because this is max and this is 0, it gives me an inertial value in the forward direction. I naturally want to go forward as I'm walking when I'm walking in a passive manner. Now, when I'm walking in a active manner, like this, because these are the same values, there is none of this inertial tendency. Now, why is this inertial tendency important? Well, it's because of gravity. You see, when we have this inertial tendency to go forward, what we're really doing is replacing the effort required by our legs in the form of gravity. We are literally using gravity to aid in our movement. This force, this torque right here, part of this is generated by gravity, because this right here, that arrow, okay? In fact, let me go ahead and draw this on a separate page so that it's easier to see. Where if I had a stick figure, like this, and this is essentially what I look like here, where up there's the head, that would be the torso, that's my leg, or rear-facing leg, and that is my forward-facing leg. Let me clean this up. And that was the torque amount. Well, if I took this arrow, and I redrew it over here, well, I could say that this is actually composed of two different components. This has a horizontal component, which is gravity, and it also has this horizontal component, which is caused by how your body is positioned and the fact that your body is kind of acting as a sort of lever, but that's besides the point. This is also caused by gravity. But it means that gravity isn't just pulling down, gravity is also essentially pulling you over in the left direction. Gravity is pulling you left. And so that as we're walking passively, we are able to utilize gravity to our advantage to move our bodies that way, to be able to move our bodies over. Whereas when we're walking actively, because we're situated equal distance between our forward-facing leg and our rear-facing leg, we don't have the ability to rely on these gravitational vectors. We don't have assistance in this sense, So we have to generate all the force with our legs. And that's the big difference between walking actively versus walking passively. Now you might be wondering how much of a difference this can possibly make. And while I don't really have absolute numbers, I can tell you that it is more than you might think. I would venture to say that by walking actively, so in an active walking style, versus a passive walk, that you're going to burn, I would venture to say, something like twice the amount of calories active walking to passive walking. I would venture to say that if we were to call the amount of calories that you burn while walking just X, so a passive would be X calories, that the active walk would have 2X. And that probably sounds like a fairly bold claim, but it isn't as bold as you might think it is. And there's a good reason for this. And it has to do with how these walking styles create feedback loops. Basically, when you're walking actively, okay, it requires more muscle. And it requires more muscle, remember, because in our passive walk we had this gravity vector which aided, in particular this part of the gravity vector, aided in our movement. So then this requires less muscle. Now because this requires more muscle, it also requires more effort. And this, by extension, requires less effort. Now because this requires more effort, and this requires less effort, it also means that it requires more calories, which I already stated, that this requires, let's say, twice as much, and this requires half as much, or half as many. Let's move this to where that goes. Down there. Okay, so active walking takes more muscle, which requires more effort, which requires more calories, and passive walking requires less muscle, so it takes less effort, and so it requires fewer calories. And ultimately, what this results in is that this places more stress on the body. It places a higher demand. And this requires, the passive walk requires less stress, or places less stress, and requires and places a lesser demand on the body. And all of this creates a feedback loop. Basically, all we're saying is that active walking is going to put more stress on your body, okay? It's going to have a higher demand, which will take more muscle, because remember that with active walking, we don't have either of these vectors, basically, to help, because our torso is situated an equidistance from our forward-facing leg to our rear-facing leg. So it's because of that reason why this requires more effort, because we have no gravitational aid. And because we need to output more effort, that's going to take more calories to generate. And of course, the more calories you burn translates into losing more weight. And in particular, not just any weight, but more fat. This is what this really translates to, is because you're placing a higher stress on your body, because you're placing a higher demand on the body, you're going to burn more fat, and in fact you're going to replace it with muscle. You're going to replace that with muscle, and the more muscle you have, the more calories you're going to burn. Okay? And so, while this does demand more muscle, it also generates more muscle. And so, walking actively gets easier with time, whereas walking passively has less stress, places less demand, and so it takes less muscle, which means it puts less effort, requires less effort, which are these two things. This less effort is just another way of saying less stress and less demand, in the same way that more effort is just another way of saying more stress or more demand. And so because it takes less muscle, it requires less effort, it's going to burn fewer calories. And in fact, it is going to result in, if anything, not just lose less weight, but you're going to be losing more muscle. Because the amount of muscle you have the number or amount of muscle you have is based on demand. And because of this, because of the fact that the amount of muscle you have is based on whatever it is, or however it is that you are demanding your body, whatever you're demanding your body do, because they are interrelated, if you place less stress on it, you're going to have less muscle, which means you're going to burn fewer calories. Less muscle equals fewer calories. Because you are burning now fewer calories, it means your metabolism goes down, and so you will lose less weight. And this creates a very big negative feedback loop, which encourages you to use even more gravitational aid and makes it much harder to even start active walking in the first place. And so you become locked into this walking style.